to work it or?
Got it.
Good evening.
How we doing?
Very good.
All right.
I
I'm excited to be
suppose
doing this finally.
I'm too. Thank you for doing this. This looks like our first episode of our Unveiling the Civil War podcast. My name is Ben Cwayna.
Hi, Ben.
Hi,
Hi,
Ben.
Ben.
We have Dylan Obney and Ben Flowerday as well joining us.
Cheers.
I
Cheers,
thought you
gentlemen.
were going to give a little background and introduction. That's why we
All right,
kind of
all
paused
right,
there,
you want,
Ben.
all right. Well, let's start all over. I'll do it. Go ahead. Can you re-record it?
Just run with it. We're good.
All right.
We can edit it or something.
So yeah, this is our we're gonna start a podcast with the three of us. It's basically gonna be a Civil War themed podcast with I guess we're gonna call it a living historian's twist. Is that right, gentlemen?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's really kind of what we're trying to get at here is, we're trying to talk about the history of not just like the battles and the leaders and strategy and tactics and all that stuff, but also trying to appeal to the authentic campaigners out there, the living historians, all the guys out there that are trying to accurately recreate these guys.
Yeah, and so we're gonna be taking a look at different aspects of the war, battles, reenacting topics down the line as well. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, which was taking place in June of 1864, kind of at the culmination of the first half of what we would call the Atlanta campaign. And we're going to have just a roundtable discussion about that, and we hope people enjoy it. Any further comments from the peanut gallery there?
I'm just excited. I'm ready. This is something that we've all been talking about doing for a little while now, and I'm glad we're finally actually getting down and doing it. We got a whole bunch of stuff we want to talk about, and I think it's gonna be really cool to start getting some good conversations going that people are gonna actually want to listen to.
Yeah. So real quick, do you want to introduce yourselves a bit, give some background, and I don't know, for those of us who have credentials at Cwayna,
Yeah.
feel free to gloat a little bit.
Yeah, now's your chance, Cwayna.
Well, Ben Cwayna, I've been Civil War reenactor for about 30 years. Been doing the hobby for most of my life. I've really enjoyed it. I've kind of gone through different elements of rank and things, and kind of enjoying getting more into the authenticity area of it the last 10 or so years with the group that I'm involved with. I think it's always it's a journey, not a destination. And I think that's one thing that I'm learning is a lot more of those things, learning about supply and learning about how the uniforms were distributed and all those sorts of things. A big history buff, Army Northern Virginia, Eastern Theater guy. I'm writing a book currently on the 12th South Carolina Regiment, which is one of the units that we portray in our reenacting organization, and it's supposed to be published next spring, hopefully, by Sabas Beatty. And really looking forward to having that out. It's going to be a full-length regimental history on the 12th South Carolina, and I'm sure we'll get into some of those discussions down the road. And in my background today, I've got a little homage to the guys from the 12th South Carolina crossing the Potomac River at Boatler's Ford on September 17th, 1862, although that's not the battle that we're going to be discussing today. So I'm an attorney in my real life, one son, and just I really enjoy history. I love studying the history of the Civil War, and I like teaching it to people and showing people what it's all about.
Here, here.
Go ahead,
Ben, you want
Dylan.
to go next?
I can take it. I'm Ben Flowerday. I have been reenacting for almost 10 years now. Ben Cwayna is actually kind of the man who is responsible for getting me into it more seriously. So by no coincidence, I share a lot of the same interests, generally Eastern Theater. I also like to follow the 12th South Carolina. My personal kind of focus, especially as of the last year or so, has been kind of the last year of the war in the Eastern Theater, Overland Campaign, Grant versus Lee, earthwork defenses around Petersburg, all of that sort of stuff. I think it's something that gets a little bit glossed over as people focus on the lead up and the climax up to Gettysburg, and then everything is kind of downhill from that. I really like to dive into what I think was a very pivotal section. That said, I'm also interested in living history, doing the same sort of stuff as you guys with authenticity, learning about various regiments, various engagements, and just kind of tailoring what I'm learning to how I can apply it in the field. I am 24. I live in the Detroit area currently. But yes, really in the last, been involved in the hobby for about 10 years, but it's really been the last 3 years that I've kind of taken the bigger step towards more quote unquote academic history. So excited to get going with the podcast. I think it's an interesting platform. And I look forward to getting back out into the field as well. Dylan?
Yeah. Well, you'll be excited today, at least. We get the Overland Campaign of the West. My name's Dylan. I've been reenacting now for 13 years. I grew up I lived in Tennessee for a short time when I was younger, for about 4 years. I lived very close to the Battle of Shiloh. Grew up going to Shiloh almost every chance I got. Just riding my bike around and going all the places that you can go to there. Really great battlefield. Love, and that's kind of what inspired my passion for the Civil War. And I then moved back to California, where I was originally born, and there I joined up with a mainstream unit that was more on the progressive side, leaning towards authenticity. But we're doing the best we can out here in California, local parks and stuff that have swing sets and things like that in the back of the battlefield. But I was with that unit now for about 11 years. And then we started a new group called the Independent Western Rifles, where we try to mainly focus on immersive, authentic events, portraying specific documented instances from North and South on various campaigns or battles, and also California history, 19th century civilian, minor, and also military and militia units that were posted here in the Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego area. But yeah, the past good probably 2 or 3 years have been focused on mainly authenticity and really diving more into the history of this stuff, and just been really reading all I can, trying to get to the point where I can get a grasp on this stuff like Master Cwayna over here. But that's why we're starting this podcast. So I'm really excited to really start diving into some topics and having some good conversations for people who are actually genuinely interested in the history to be actually more inclined to listen to. So without further ado, I think we should get started on this.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. I've got we have a slideshow here. I'm going to see if I can share it here to the screen. It's a program that everybody can see it there.
Oh yeah.
It's a program that I put together a year ago for our Civil War reenactment group. After we had traveled down to the Resaca battlefield and some of the Atlanta campaign battlefields of 1864. I'm not going to go through every slide, but we will try to post this, I think, on our upcoming Facebook page to talk about the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. But I kind of termed it Sherman and Johnston's last dance before Atlanta, June 27th, 1864. It's really the last battle that's going to occur before Sherman moves into and envelops Atlanta in that May-June time period of 1864, as Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant are battling it out in Virginia. You've got Sherman and Johnston fighting down the line in North Georgia. So Battle of Kennesaw Mountain is going to kind of be the culmination of that campaign before they get to Atlanta in July of 1864. Let me see here. There's some things going on in the country, obviously. At that time, this is an election year in 1864. The Republican Party is going to rebrand itself the Union Party because things have not gone the way that the Republican Party had hoped. They kind of wish they had won the war by now, but they haven't. Lincoln is running for re-election against George McClellan, the Democrat. And despite what appears to be a Union, advantages in material and manpower and everything else, the North in the spring of 64 looks like, they could fumble the ball here and perhaps lose the war. And so Lincoln has to show military victories. He's got to show victories on the field of battle. And so he's going to have Sherman and Grant proceed with their armies to try to do that so that he can claim some military victories, which will show the people of the North that his government can win the war. I think one thing that we as amateur historians need to point out to people is that there's a fundamental connection between the home front and what's going on in the war front. And there's a direct correlation there. And so if there's good things happening on the war front, the people at home are going to support the war. If there's bad things going on in the war front, if they're losing battles, if people are dying, that's going to transition to people not wanting to support the Republican Party or the Union Party that fall. And so, that's a problem for Abraham Lincoln. He's got to score points in 1864 because the war is it's not won yet. It's close, but he hasn't been able to take all the chess pieces off the board for the Confederacy. The Union Army is going to be basically divided up into three army groups, we call them. And I'm not going to go into all of those today. We just don't have enough time. But there's obviously the Army of the Cumberland, the Army of the Tennessee, and the Army of the Ohio. These are going to be three army groups that are going to proceed from Chattanooga towards Atlanta. The Army of Tennessee under Joe Johnston is going to be, that venerable army that's fought in the Western Theater for the entire war. Johnston is going to take over for Braxton Bragg that winter between 63 and 64. The men love Johnston. He's a favorite. He's going to instill high morale in the army. He's got 2 corps of infantry, and he's probably going to get a third sometime as the campaign evolves southward. He's going to get another corps under Leonidas Polk.
But he needs more.
He does need more.
Briefly under Leonidas Polk as
I'm sorry, what was that?
well, I said it was briefly under Polk, but Polk disappeared in the middle of
Yes.
June.
Yes.
He gets what the kids call aired out.
So here are the Sherman's objectives basically at the beginning of the campaign, according to Grant, is going to be that he's supposed to get into the interior of Georgia and break up Johnston's army. He doesn't really say much about taking Atlanta. He doesn't say what any specific goals are as far as going in and taking Atlanta per se, although that has to be one of the things that is on the table. But his goal is to go after Johnston's army, just like Grant is supposed to be going after Lee's army. And so the Confederate armies in the field are the objectives here. It's not to necessarily take Richmond. It's not necessarily to take Atlanta, although those are great things to do. But if you take those and you leave the armies in the field, again, we're not accomplishing much as far as the war aims. And so the objective is to get at Johnston's army and go at it with a bulldog grip.
So here's a quick question. I don't know if you want to actually dive into it now, if you want to get
Sure.
through the slide.
No, go ahead.
So, okay, so by June of 1864, because you kind of posed the question, is Sherman disobeying orders? By June of 1864, who would you say is more successful in their campaign, Sherman or Grant?
By
By
June of
the start of
1860
June.
by June of 1864, I would say, well, it's a tough question. If you break it down in that way, Grant is just outside of Richmond. He's within a couple miles of Richmond because he's at Cold Harbor on
Yeah.
June 3rd. And I would say that Lee's army is not destroyed by any means.
No, and keep in mind, exactly, Cold Harbor still hasn't even happened yet.
Right. And so Sherman has advanced close to Atlanta, but he's not there yet. He hasn't, and he likewise has not destroyed Johnston's army. So I think that's, I don't know if I can answer that.
Now, I think
How about you?
if you base your measure of success off of just like pure body count at this point, which I mean really is all you can base it off of, especially since right now, since their main goal is to just, I mean, Grant and Sherman both, their main goal is to break up their opponent's army. And at this point in the campaigns, Grant has sustained way higher casualties in a honestly shorter time frame than Sherman has. And now Sherman is probably intentionally avoiding this, going through flanking maneuvers, whereas Grant is just, hammering and putting meat in the meat grinder against Lee. I think if you're going to measure it off of that, you have to say that Sherman's more successful. Because I mean, between May 25th and May 27th, you have like over 26,000 losses in both armies. There's just, I mean, carnage up there in Virginia. And if you're looking at what's going on down south at this point, it's a lot of this maneuvering, small skirmishing, some big, like the big fights, quote unquote, there are a loss of, 1,600 men at Pickett Mill. I think just you really like at the start of June, it's hard to say that Sherman is necessarily disobeying orders if by that sense that you could say he's just, in a sense more successful than Grant is.
No, but I would counter and say that Sherman, we've got the map up here of some of the initial battles, but Sherman never goes after Johnston like Grant goes after Lee. And vice versa. Johnston never goes after Sherman like Lee goes after Grant.
No, it's a completely different character of a campaign. It's a
completely different campaign.
Yeah. Lee and Grant were each explicitly looking to fight each other. I mean, if you look at Wilderness, they were both on the move, trying to find each other as quickly as possible. Whereas when you look at the opening of the Atlanta campaign, Sherman's trying to get around Johnston and Johnston's trying to run away from Sherman rather than either of them
trying to build up his
seeking to
army at first. He's kind of just sitting there at Dalton, just really just trying to build and hold as long as possible without necessarily bringing on an engagement. But when he was just hoping that he would be strong enough to be to win on the defensive, when he did hit. Whereas he's not actively looking for Sherman to push him out of Georgia and drive him into Tennessee.
Yeah, it's a totally different campaign. And I think, you can judge the results for yourself. I think if the goal is to break up Johnston's army, I don't think Sherman has done that. And I don't think he does it ever, because he never really grabs Johnston by the neck and forces him into these sorts of fights that are going to grind him down the way that Grant is trying to grind Lee down. And so,
and several times Johnston even forces Sherman to really change his whole battle plans and his whole plan of attack just by maneuvering. Go back to that map real quick, if you would. I just really love. I know we're about to talk about Kennesaw. We're kind of wasting time, but I really just this whole campaign going into Kennesaw is so interesting. Like there's so many different like maneuvers and little skirmishes that happen, and it's at what point I was wondering what point do they start referring to it as the hellhole? Is that like from the start of the campaign, or is that only down there in Pickett's Mill and New Hope Church and Gilgal Church and all that?
As far as what I've read is they started calling it when they were down near Pickett's Mill and Dallas and New Hope Church.
Okay, so it's not referring to the whole campaign though,
right?
Like Resaca and all that.
Right. Yep.
Okay.
And so you're going to see a series of basically Sherman advances, flanks Johnston out of his position, and it happens over and over and over. And, as I like to joke with some of the guys, Johnston gets up every morning and he likes to retreat. He says it's a great day to retreat. And that's what he does. And he does it all the way down to the outskirts of Atlanta. At one point, Sherman does try to kind of, and we should point out here that they're both basically using the axis of the Western and Atlantic Railroad as their axis of advance. Sherman from the north, Johnston from the south. There's one time during the campaign, and that's, those battles around Pickett's Mill and New Hope Church in late May, where Sherman tries to deviate from that plan. He tries to shift to the west. Johnston actually does a really good job trying to catch him there. He does. He thwarts him. They stand there and they fight for a few days, and then Sherman has to get back to the Western and Atlantic for his supply route, and he continues that trek towards Kennesaw Mountain.
That's present day Interstate Highway 75. By the way, it's pretty much the same exact route.
Correct.
Into Atlanta.
As we said, by June 1st, Sherman's going to kind of get back into, that Western and Atlantic line. Leonidas Polk, one of the Confederate generals, is going to be killed there at Brushy Mountain. And Johnston kind of falls back to what we call the Kennesaw line. And here's a good photograph of Big Kennesaw during the Civil War. Kennesaw Mountain has kind of four terrain features: Big Kennesaw, Little Kennesaw, Pigeon Hill, and Cheatham Hill. Those are
they actually were they calling it Pigeon Hill at the time of the battle? I read that was only like a post-war years they started referring to it because apparently there was a bunch of pigeons that would come there like during migration season.
That very well could be, Dylan. I'm not exactly sure about that.
Wonder if we'll have to Google that or something.
Cheatham Hill certainly was a post-war thing because that's where Cheatham Division fought.
But I don't know. I was wondering if that was from like the locals at the time or if that's only post-war.
Like I said, I'm not quite sure on that. To the left here is a map of Johnston's line. Loring had taken over for Polk's Corps. You got Hardy in the center, and Hood, John Bell Hood, who's a corps commander now, is on the left. Big Kennesaw is on the right. That's Polk's former Army of the Mississippi Corps. He's draped across that western face of the mountain. Hardy's Corps continues Johnston's line to the south, down towards what is going to become to be known as Cheatham's Hill. And Hood, he's going to hold the very left flank in a lot lower ground to the south. And so it's a formidable line, as you can see, and it's anchored with good ground on both flanks, although the northern flank is a much better anchor for the Confederate Army. Sherman's dispositions, he has McPherson's Army of the Tennessee holding the left flank, Thomas's Army of the Cumberland in the center, and Schofield's Army of the Ohio on the right. The Kennesaw line is about 7 miles long. Sherman's, the outer exterior line, is nearly 10. And Sherman's line, however, has strings of wire and telegraph set up so that they can communicate between the different wings. Here's some photographs of the Confederate lunettes and works. A lot of work went into the preparation of these works, and they're still there for people that want to go look at them. It's one of the best preserved Confederate earthworks I think I've ever seen. I don't know how
I agree. No, that's like when I was working in Georgia and got to just on my time off, I would go and visit the battlefield. And when I saw the earthworks that were still there at Kennesaw, I couldn't believe it because I'd seen you see like at other spots like the Wilderness up there, and gosh, I mean, there's so many, like up in Gettysburg and stuff like that around Pennsylvania and Maryland. But there is nothing that is as big as Kennesaw. I mean, these things are just giant earthworks that are still there to this day. I love that picture that of the drawing, the sketch of all the Confederate artillerymen
Yeah,
uh dragging their artillery pieces up the hill. There's like 20 guys pulling that thing up.
yep,
I can just imagine the stream of profanities that was coming pouring out of that picture right there.
yep,
That
yep,
just looks miserable right there.
yep.
But they got him up there, and that was one thing that almost you see in Daniel Vermilya talks about it in that book, that almost every account, like every written diary, talks about how much artillery was coming down off that hill, like almost every day from like starting really like the fighting really started around June 19th with like skirmishing and artillery coming down, and it didn't stop for the entire campaign until they pulled out and started heading uh towards the Chattahoochee. I mean, they really just hammered down on him for so long.
Here are some the photographs in the prior slide were some other defensive works. June 22nd is going to be that engagement down at Kolb's Farm. It's basically kind of a probing action by Hood. It's not going to amount to much. And basically Hood's going to decide on his own to kind of attack Sherman's flank down there. However, the as I said, the terrain down there is it's bad. It's swampy, it's low ground, and he was forced to withdraw. So not much happens at Kolb's Farm for our purposes. Sherman is going to decide to basically send a frontal assault onto the works, onto the line. This will be the first time he does it during the campaign. He's been very conservative thus far. He's been flanking, he's been maneuvering, he's fought some battles, but they're not on the scale of what's going on in Virginia. And so this is going to be, kind of his first all-out frontal assault during the campaign. And he's feeling some of the pressure. He's quite a ways away from his supply base at Chattanooga. He's getting closer to Atlanta. And I kind of look at the two battles, Cold Harbor and Kennesaw, very similarly. I think Grant at Cold Harbor wanted to punch through at Cold Harbor to see if he could take Richmond. It was so close, he could taste it. And I think Sherman kind of felt the same thing at Kennesaw. He's so close to Atlanta, he's going to try to punch through.
Yeah, and you also have to. I mean, this is literally Johnston's last position where he can make a strong defensive line to hold before he gets to Atlanta. Because when you look, I mean, you have west of everything important is west of this position. You have the Western Atlantic Railroad to the northwest by Hood's position, and then you also have the Chattahoochee to the south, and then you also have the town of Murrieta, and then what's farther than that? Atlanta.
Yep.
It's the last spot. So I think, and then you have even all the Confederates, I think, were finally anticipating Sherman to also make a frontal attack finally. And you have I thought this was interesting. You have a quote right here from Lieutenant Colonel Columbus Skies of the 43rd Mississippi. And he said, going into Kennesaw, I think it was probably around June 19th. I'm not sure. There's no date on it. But I think Sherman's flanking process has nearly played out, and he must soon come down to his work by making a direct attack on our front. For this purpose, he may someday suddenly mass his troops on some given point and attempt by mere brute force to break through our lines. I think, however, he will find us ready for him at all points of the line. The on to Atlanta movement has become very slow as well as dangerous. I thought that was kind of cool. They're kind of already, they not only are they very well entrenched and ready for Sherman to make this attack, but like they almost want him to.
Yeah. And so Sherman's going to decide to strike. He's going to plan it for June 27th. His flanks are going to they're going to be the demonstrations to prevent shifting of troops. Classic Civil War tactics here. Nothing new, with the main assault coming on Johnston's center and left center. which is lower, more accessible ground. And so this is kind of what he's got going on here. He's going to have Logan is going to attack against Little Kennesaw and Pigeon Hill with 3 brigades. Going to have that's going to basically be hitting kind of the northern third of Johnston's Kennesaw line. They were able to hit some of these and make some progressions. But again, if I have one criticism of Sherman in this battle, he's not throwing in a lot of troops. He's not throwing in his whole army. It's piecemeal, for lack of a better term. Thomas is going to attack Cheatham Hill directly to the south. And their main attack is going to come against Hardee's Corps about 9 a.m. They're going to throw in about 2 divisions of the Army of the Cumberland are going to be engaged. They're going to advance in column formation rather than the typical broad line. So they're going for depth rather than length. And we see that strategy and that tactic also in the Overland campaign at Spotsylvania Courthouse on May 12th. So federal commanders are using a deeper, more condensed battle attack than the traditional long lines that we see earlier in the war. It's going to go up. This attack is going to go up against the Confederate divisions of Ben Cheatham and Patrick Cleburne, which are entrenched on what is now known as Cheatham's Hill. These are some maps of the 4th Corps' attack. Order of battle for those brigades and regiments. We all know Pat Cleburne. He's one of the toughest division commanders in the Army of Tennessee. Newton and Howard are going to hit him square in his entrenched lines. He's got 4 very strong brigades under Dan Govan, Lucius Polk, Mark Lowry, and Hiram Granberry, consisting of Tennesseans, Arkansans, Alabamians, and Texans. And they're going to hold this line. Here's another map of kind of what we're looking at with Cleburne and Cheatham. So we got Cleburne's on the right and Cheatham's on the left. And the salient here along Cheatham's Hill, as you can see it protruding out into this open kind of field. We've got Vaughn's Tennessee Brigade from Patrick Cleburne's, I'm sorry, from Cheatham's division, and then Maney's Tennessee Brigade is going to be to the left. And then Cleburne's division off to the right. So we've got basically Tennesseans holding that angle, that salient at Cheatham Hill.
And then obviously the 1st and 27th, you get some awesome, just crazy accounts from Company H from Sam Watkins, who's just right there in the very middle on the salient.
Yeah, yep. 1st Tennessee is going to be right there in the very middle with them in the 27th Tennessee.
What's crazy to me is that those guys specifically had been, I mean, they've been through much bigger fights than what happened in Kennesaw. I mean, Shiloh, Corinth, all the rest of the 1862 campaigns, they were in the Shenandoah Valley with Jackson for a while, but all of them, he says that specifically, like if you asked any single one of them, that this is the battle that would say was the absolute worst. And it just, I mean, it's one thing to talk about it, but like when you go there, it's really, you can see just like the absolute field of fire that they would have had. It's chilling to think about when you get there.
On the left here is a photograph of kind of that where that salient begins to protrude out, and the right are some more of those breastworks that are there, and it's going to protrude out here to this field here in these photographs here. We're looking at the upper left-hand corner. It would be a view from Dan McCook's brigade's vantage point approaching that salient. That salient's going to kind of come out into that open field there a little bit. The Illinois Monument is there up at the top. And these are the surviving earthworks of basically Vaughn's and Maney's positions, which we think are probably about where the 11th Tennessee, the 1st and the 27th Tennessee were located. And then you've got that great vista from the Illinois monument looking down. That's kind of what the Tennesseans would have looked at as the Federals would have approached their position. We have Brigadier General Charles Harker. He's going to charge Vaughn's Tennesseans. He's going to be repulsed. Harker's going to be wounded. To Vaughn's left was George Maney's brigade, that 1st Tennessee unit that Dylan was speaking about earlier. They're going to be the left. They're going to hold that salient as well. Vaughn, brigade commander, he's going to have his foot shot off several days after the battle while resting with his men along the Chattahoochee River. But again, we have
guys, let's stop here, get some water. Oh, my foot.
But here we have a really good view of kind of what that position looked like.
Oh yeah, no, I love that picture.
I love this painting up here to the top.
Yeah,
really, I think shows it very well as to what it looked like. You got the columns of men coming forward, the Confederates behind the breastworks, using those parapets, using those defensive lines. And you see kind of where it protrudes out here on the map on the left. Vaughn and Maney's brigade are kind of holding that salient. We've got Wagner, Harker, McCook, and Mitchell's brigades hitting them almost directly. And Candy's and Ireland's troops kind of moving a little bit farther to the south. But we've got, several brigades hitting this salient almost square.
What it was cool, crazy is like you were saying, this painting it really depicts, you see like the columns of these guys, but it's not just columns, it's like we were talking, I think you mentioned it later in this, the columns of brigades deploying in line of battle. So it's lines of these guys, long lines of men going in, but then right behind it is another long line of men. Each brigade is in its battle line as they're deploying.
Yep, we're going to get to that here in a minute.
Yeah.
Dan McCook, he's of that famous family, the Fighting McCooks. He's going to lead his brigade up to the dead angle. They're closed in mass in column of regiments 4 or 5 deep, so they're stacked right behind one another, like Dylan just said. And McCook is actually going to lead his men right up to the very parapet of the works. He's going to jump atop them. He's going to demand that those traitors surrender, and he's going to be wounded in the chest thereafter and carried from the field. Here is a interesting graphic that kind of will show you how they deployed. We've got Mitchell's brigade on the left, McCook's brigade on the right. Now, and what Dylan was getting at here tactically is all these regiments are stacked, right? But John Mitchell's brigade is just going to go forward in column. His 4 regiments are just going to go forward in column. He's got a much deeper skirmish line, as you see. But McCook he's going to deploy his brigade in a much different fashion. He's got a much narrower skirmish line. And as each one of these units come up to the parapet, they're going to right face, they're going to uncover the regiment to their left. They're going to front and then form onto the works. So, for example, the 125th is going to lodge up, the 125th Illinois, once it lodges up against the parapet, the 86th Illinois behind it is going to right face, it's going to move out, it's going to uncover the left flank of the 125th, it's going to front, and then it's going to hit the parapet as well. Same with the 22nd Indiana, same with the 52nd Ohio. And so that's how McCook is going to deploy his brigade. Each successive regiment will essentially right face and deploy, and then his battle line will extend to the right into a full brigade front.
And how close, do you know approximately how close to the defenses they're doing that? Are they getting up to it, or is it as they come into the clearing below the works?
They got up very close to the works. I don't think that they got over the works, but they certainly got up to them.
But they're executing the right face within 100 yards or so of the works, is what you're saying?
For sure. Probably closer. Absolutely.
I was gonna
Yeah.
say probably within 30 yards. It was probably
Yeah.
like right when they were hitting the base of that hill when they were
Yep.
actually putting up a fight, like at the bottom of the military crest right there.
And I'm
Yep.
assuming that that's probably going to be one of the least organized and right face and slow moving methodical right faces. I'm assuming they're right facing, double quicking, immediately turning back onto the works and
Yeah.
pressing
It had
then.
to have been a mob.
It's basically deploying your column on the first, if you're in a battalion, if you're
Right.
doing Civil War battalion drill, it's deploying your column on the first company to the right at the double quick when you're closed in mass.
Right. Okay.
So
Yeah.
here's a quote from
While
Sam.
also receiving thousands of musket volleys all at once.
Right.
30 yards.
It's a great old photograph of Colonel Hume there on the left, Sam Watkins and George Maney of the Tennessee Brigade. These are various depictions of the fighting at the dead angle.
That second one down that you have, that's the one that Daniel Vermiglia uses as his cover for the book right there. That's a great picture because if you go and look at the artillery dugouts that they have along that line there in Kennesaw, you can see, I mean, it looks just like that today pretty much with the massive earthworks on either side with the dugouts for the guns still in it. And it's just so well preserved.
Yep.
But I love that picture right there.
The unfortunate thing for the Union is though that these assaults are going to be repulsed with relative ease. It's not like they're not going to make any sort of inroads in these trenches. The Confederates aren't going to give way. Vaughn, Maney, Claiborne, Cheatham's division, they hold pretty fast. And the Federal forces are going to fall back to the military crest. And so they're going to actually be out of kind of below where the natural crest is of the Confederate fortifications. And they're going to be about maybe 100 yards or so, maybe less, from the Confederate lines, kind of protected by that military crest.
We were talking about the difference between military crest and natural crest. I don't know if you want to briefly explain that for people that might not understand.
Yeah, so if you look at this photo here, the Illinois monument, so we're going to be facing towards the Confederate works. You see this hole down here where they were digging in, using it as a mine. This is what I would consider to be the natural crest. And so, or the, I'm sorry, the military crest.
Right.
Excuse me, the military crest. And so, but the Confederates their works were up here farther up behind that monument on the natural crest. And so the natural crest is probably like the highest point that you can get, but it doesn't always give you the best field of fire. The military crest is maybe lower on the hill, but it might give you a better field of fire. And the military crest might actually make it so you can't fire up to the natural crest and vice versa, the way that the way the topography is. And so what happens is these Federals, after they hit the works, they're going to fall back to this crest, this military crest, and they're going to hunker down, and they're going to basically be staying there for a couple of days and trading shots with the Confederates in the dead angle.
Yeah.
So
Here's a quick
much,
question.
yeah.
So do you think it would have been to the Confederates' advantage or disadvantage had they made that their line just there at the salient right there protrude west just a little bit more and cover the military crest and make their entrenchments there? Do you think if they had entrenched there on the military crest, they would have had an advantage or disadvantage?
I think they would have had an advantage because I think they would have had a much clearer field of fire. A much
Do you don't
longer.
think being closer and off of the higher ground would present more of a danger?
I don't, because I think if you go there, and this is why going to these battlefields are so interesting. When I go there and I stand on that military crest, you've got a full field of fire down to the woods that the Federals came out of. However, if you're back in the Confederate works and the lunettes on the natural crest, you can fire, but it's a lot more difficult because you got to fire essentially kind of over that military crest. And so I'm sorry, I'm getting my crests mixed up here, but the it's the I think you want to always take the military crest versus the natural crest, because that will allow you not only to have an open field of fire, but it also allows you a place to fall back to, i.e. the natural crest.
Exactly.
My
Yeah, so
only-
even if it does present more of a danger to being closer and off of the higher ground, you still have that higher ground to go back to if you get
Right.
overran, if you have a problem on the front right there. You
Right.
make secondary entrenchments behind the military crest towards the natural crest.
My counter to that, though, is if you look at the map of Kennesaw and how far out this salient, the dead angle already is, if you're extending beyond there, you're either disconnecting yourself with the main body of the rest of the army or spreading yourself out thinner and thinner. I'm wondering if just because of the topography and the lines of the other divisions of the army, they kind of had to make that sacrifice there and just decided to remain closer and connected, which
I think
would be
that's a
my
great
guess
point.
there.
I think that's a great point, and I would totally concur with that. I think Confederate engineers probably didn't want to overextend themselves, and they probably never thought that the Union troops would be foolish enough to stay hunkered down underneath that military crest for a few days in the hot June sun.
Or if they did, I mean, clearly they didn't. I mean, they didn't gain much by doing it other than
They didn't.
getting there. If the mine would have maybe gone off, but then you
The
probably
mine was
just
a
have
pipe dream at best.
it's an off-brand the crater. I
Yeah,
think.
exactly. The mine was a pipe dream at best. There was no way they were under that kind of fire and that amount of stress. There's no way they were going to be able to pull off an operation like that.
Nope, but they're going to try, and for 5 days they're going to skirmish between these two lines. They're going to take casualties. They're going to have some truces, which we'll talk about. They're going to try to dig a mine. The federal troops are going to try to dig a mine under the salient, try to blow it up. And there are a couple of different truces during this time. One is going to be called by Colonel William Martin of Cleburne's division. He's going to allow Union troops to come get their wounded from a fire that had sprung up between the lines. That's what this engraving is showing. This is actually during the battle.
That part's actually, it's not far from the salient actually either. It's very close to that point in the line.
Correct. Yep. On June 29th, after the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, 2 days later, there's going to be another truce called right in front of the dead angle by Colonel Horace Rice, the officer of the day for Vaughn's Tennessee Brigade. And that's going to take all day on June 29th, so the Federals can get their dead out of there who are really stinking up the area. The men talk about the stench, the decomposing bodies. You know, this is June in Georgia. Federals are laying out there, bloating, decomposing. And so in kind of a sense of humanity, they're going to call a truce and they're going to try to get these guys out of there. Interestingly enough, a lot of Confederate celebrities made their way out there as well. Ben Cheatham, Pat Claiborne, George Maney, they were all recognized by the federal troops. I thought this was an interesting quote. Cheatham was described by one Federal was dressed in an old slouch hat, a blue hickory shirt, butternut pants, and a pair of cavalry boots. It's not how you would expect a Confederate major general to be dressed, but maybe you would in June of in 1864 in Georgia. I don't know.
Yeah.
Kind of clearing things up here and finalizing what happened. You know, the battle, Sherman's going to lose about 3,000 men in the assault. Johnston's going to lose about a third of that. Sherman contemplates another assault, but he's dissuaded by his subordinates who state that such assaults will use up the army. I think that's foolish. I think Sherman didn't throw in as many men as he should have in this attack. I think he certainly could have tripled the number of men that attacked, and he wouldn't have been he wouldn't have lost anything significantly had he done that. And so my big concern with Kennesaw Mountain from a federal perspective is they didn't send enough men in to make it work. There just wasn't enough there to push through. They had the
They're
men to
also
do it.
hitting
Just
kind of
couldn't do it.
like they're also hitting like different parts of the line, kind of almost in an uncoordinated like fashion. Like they're hitting, down on the right, a couple days before, and then all of a sudden they're gonna send in this force on the salient with, and overwhelm it, but they're not even sending in as many forces as they possibly could to overwhelm it. Like if you're gonna overwhelm a position, you
Yep.
need to you need to mass your men at that point, and to
Yep.
have as many troops left over as he did without ever seeing action at that point, I think is a huge mistake on Sherman's part, for sure.
I agree. It's a short-term high morale boost for Johnston's army. It's I say in my presentation here, it's arguably it's perhaps the pinnacle of his leadership of the Army of Tennessee. It's really the only clear-cut victory that he has with the army. But it doesn't last that long, because within a few days, Sherman's going to slide his army again to the south. He's going to the east and the south. He's going to cross the Chattahoochee, and he's going to eventually, encircle and envelop Atlanta. Johnston's going to be removed from command by Davis. Davis by mid-July, he's going to have enough with Johnston's kind of tepid command of the Army of Tennessee, and he's going to put Hood in command. Hood is going to strike out very quickly and aggressively against Sherman's armies at Atlanta with mixed results. But ultimately, the two armies are going to, ironically, march away from each other. Hood's going to march into Alabama and then north into Tennessee. And as we all know, Sherman's army is going to march to its destiny to the sea in that infamous march that's going to take place in the winter of 1864 and 1865, as he shreds what's left of the Confederacy. But Kennesaw Mountain is kind of the last time that the Johnston's army can really inflict any sort of major damage upon Sherman. But it's because Sherman didn't attack with everything. He didn't lose a lot of men, but he also didn't gain much either. Kind of some concluding thoughts here. People can read them for themselves, but Sherman had kind of grown impatient with the stalemate. He worried about a couple of different things. He worried basically that his supply line was going to be cut, and that he thought that Johnston, if he was so well entrenched, he would send troops to Lee. And that was one thing that he and Grant absolutely were afraid of. They didn't want Johnston sending troops to R.E. Lee up in Virginia. And so Sherman's attack at Kennesaw may not have been the decisive moment that he thought. Maybe it was more of just hey, I want to kind of keep Johnston's attention here, and I'm going to do as little as I can so that Johnston doesn't, send troops to Lee. There's that argument as well. The ORs are replete with evidence that both Grant and Sherman figured a repeat of the prior fall, when Longstreet and two divisions from the NV were sent west. He was afraid it was going to act in reverse, that Johnston was going to send troops to Lee. And so his attack at Kennesaw was an attempt to prevent that from happening as well. But I also think that had he been successful, he could have walked right into Atlanta. If he had been able to split Johnston's line there and send him back packing, I think he could have possibly sent Johnston packing and really inflicted a great deal of damage on Johnston had he marshaled his troops and used them advantageously instead of piecemeal. The positions that he assaulted, Sherman meaning, he could have been carried, but unfortunately he only utilized 8 brigades out of the 54 in the army.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's kind of where we end up with Kennesaw Mountain.
Now, so do you think that there's any other spot along, either in the hellhole or in the times before that during the Atlanta campaign, that Johnston really has a better chance to destroy Sherman's armies, if he has one at all?
I'm not as studied up on Atlanta as I am in other facets of the war, but I would say if he's going to, I think he has 2 shots. One, right off the bat, he's got to hit Sherman in the mouth when he leaves Chattanooga. Lee did the same thing with Grant. He's got to make Sherman pay with blood and toil every mile that Sherman advances to.
At Rocky Face Ridge, you're saying would have
Yes.
been probably is. So do you blame more
But
Johnston?
I mean, the other place I think he could have done it would have been at Dalton and New Hope Church and Pickett's Mill when Sherman had moved himself from his supply line. I think that would have been an excellent opportunity for Johnston to either try to block him from getting back to his supply line, if he could have, or used his cavalry, which I think was very under deployed during this campaign, to cut the supply lines north. So I think Johnston should have fought Sherman in the same manner that Lee fought Grant in '64 campaign in Virginia, and made Sherman pay for every inch he got.
Now, I just don't see at what point in the campaign really it's like it's not so much Johnston just not being ready to attack as so much as him not being in a good position by getting outflanked and outmaneuvered by Sherman. So how do you make him pay if you're going to be either surrounded, cut off, or completely crushed in the process? Because if you look like Rocky Face Ridge right off the bat, Hood has the Army of the Ohio coming down on his right. Army of the Tennessee is already going through Snake Creek Gap, trying to get to the left and rear. So, Johnston kind of blames Hood for pulling out of Rocky Face Ridge when, he thinks that the information he received about the Army of the Ohio is false, when in fact it wasn't. And so then they pull back down to Resaca and form the Resaca line. Now, at Resaca, he's flanked on both sides. So I just don't see how you make him pay when you're already in that terrible position and need to fall back again. Now, the only other argument I'd say to that is on the retreat from Resaca, you have Addersville and then Calhoun and then Addersville, where Johnston just says like the terrain's too bad to hold a defensive line here and just basically goes right past them. So I don't know if maybe there you're saying like he could hold a spot there and make him pay for something there. Are you saying like he wasn't right in his judgment about the terrain there? Or where in this spot is he supposed to really make him pay for it? Is what
I think anywhere, and I think you're thinking too much like a defensive Johnston. I think you got to take your chance. Lee, nothing is perfect in this war.
Sorry, is my long street showing?
No, it's okay. I mean, I know that but I'm gonna take a playbook out of Lee here. I think you gotta realize that they're always gonna have more men. If they want to, they can have a longer line than yours, and you got to find their weak spot and take advantage of that with everything you've got. And I think at Rocky Face Ridge, he did have an opportunity to kind of seal off Buzzard's Roost and some other areas there. And I think
that would have to be Johnston's fault, or I'm sorry, that would have to be Hood's fault then, not Johnston's, because Johnston was ready to hit him at Rocky Face Ridge, and then Hood pulled out.
Yeah, no,
so that's not really Johnston to blame there.
No, but ultimately Johnston's the commander of the army, and you've got to get your men ready to go. But if not there at Rocky Face, certainly somewhere on the line between Rocky Face Ridge and Kennesaw Mountain, he could have constructed or planned an offensive assault, flank assault, something.
There's so many advantages for the Union Army, but one way to mitigate advantage is speed. Because even if you have a sizably larger force in your front, if you hit them quickly while they're disorganized, that can essentially take out a corps logistically if you do it right.
That's a great example at which one was it? When they're about the army, I think it was right before. I think it's in Dallas. Basically, the day after it's the day after Pickett's Mill. Johnston turns his attention to the Union right and decides to attack them outside of Dallas and New Hope Church area. And if he had waited a few hours, they were going to be pulling out of their entrenchments at that point and heading northwest back to the railroads. So if they had delayed that attack a few hours, they would have absolutely rolled an army that was packing up and moving out. But instead, they hit them first thing in the morning, and they were ready for it. And then you have 1,600 casualties on Johnston's left.
I think to simplify it, I think what I'm looking for Johnston is to try to take the initiative from Sherman. I think that's something that Lee always tried to do, and I think Johnston, had he done more of trying to do that during the initial phases of the campaign, don't let Sherman get into a swing of things. It was just this constant. Sherman takes a position, Johnston falls back. Sherman flanks Johnston out of his position, Johnston falls back. I want to see Johnston flanking Sherman. I want to see some flank marches. I want to see a Chancellorsville. I want to see Hood and his 20,000 men on a flank march at Dallas to just surprise attack the Yankees. I mean, I want to see something, because he's got to make Sherman respond to what he's doing, not the other way around.
He's letting Sherman dictate the course of the campaign instead of being a thorn in his, at the very least, being a thorn in his side, preventing him from moving exactly where he wants to.
I just think,
every man that
starts.
Johnston kills in Sherman's army is probably a vote against the Lincoln administration in November. Okay. If Johnston makes Sherman's life a bloody mess from Rocky Face Ridge to Atlanta, just like Lee did from the Wilderness to Richmond or Petersburg, you've got a much more weary war northern population than you do otherwise. Because Sherman takes Atlanta and it's all rosy because he hasn't lost any men. He lost men, don't get me wrong, but comparatively speaking to Grant's losses, he lost relatively nothing compared to what Grant lost in the Overland campaign. Yeah. And he got a nice prize at the end. What I'm saying is, make him earn it if you're Joe Johnston. Because the only way you're going to win this war at this point in the war, you're not going to win it on the field. You're going to win it politically. If Lincoln doesn't win election in 1864, McClellan is elected, and you hope that to sue for peace, you've got to make the northern populace tired of this war so that they elect a peace Democrat.
That's kind of the thing, though. That just goes, that goes against who Johnston is as a commander. His whole thing is, I would rather give up ground than sacrifice precious manpower.
Yep.
I mean,
what I'm saying is,
in his shoes, it's hard to blame him. I mean, he has an army of 50,000 or so strong at its max, and it's after he spends months rebuilding it as soon as he takes command and begging for more troops. All while Sherman has 3 actual armies. I mean, the army of the Tennessee wasn't nearly as big as the army of the Cumberland, but it's still, half the size of Johnston's forces practically.
And Dylan, let me ask you a question. What happens when Confederate armies get pushed back into their cities and there's a siege? What usually happens? What happened to Vicksburg?
They dig in.
No, what ultimately happened to Vicksburg?
Oh, they surrendered.
What happened to Fort Donelson?
They surrendered.
Memphis, Nashville.
I see where you're going with this.
Okay, so every time the Confederates play that game, it doesn't work for them.
I would say that's probably the argument point to it is if you look at every campaign that Johnston's a part of, it's Shiloh, Corinth, Vicksburg, and then Chattanooga.
Look at Johnston on the Peninsular campaign and the campaign against Richmond in 1862.
Guess what would have happened there? McClellan would have laid siege to Richmond, and McClellan would have been brilliant at that. He would have brought up his big guns. He would have circled Richmond. He would have rode out on his horse and said what a great general he is, and look at how great I look and all my men, he would have laid siege to Richmond, and Johnston would have let him, and the Confederate capital would have fallen in the summer of 62.
I
Whenever
don't disagree with that.
Confederates-
You really see his tactics playing out throughout his whole career. It's the same jive every single time.
Story. And whenever
Yeah.
Confederates back up, and you see this with Lee at Petersburg, when Lee backs up to Petersburg, what happens? Bad things happen when Confederates get bottled up in a city. They get surrounded. They have to keep their men out in the field, out marching, out fighting. And so as long as those Confederate armies are in the field, the Confederacy lives. And that's what they're trying to play for in 64.
That
So-
didn't work so well in Pennsylvania.
It did not, but I would argue that I would argue that the Pennsylvania campaign extended the Civil War maybe for a year and a half.
Oh yeah, I would not argue with that at all. That's actually a really good point.
One moment. You guys continue conversation. I gotta take a phone call here. Apologies.
But no,
Unreal.
no, you're not wrong. Sure, Johnston didn't have a pool of men to take from, but
It's easy to see why he would want to be cautious when his enemy is over 109,000 men strong, and you have less than 60,000 men at your disposal. And
but he could have pulled more. Davis, I think if Johnston would have shown that he was an aggressive commander, I think Davis would have pulled troops from the deep south.
I just think he didn't get the jump. It all starts right at the beginning.
Yeah.
And if he had taken his decision to stay in Dalton and rebuild the army and try to dig in around Rocky Face Ridge, that's ultimately what cost him from Davis wanting to actually send him help and send him troops. Because at that point, he was robbed of being able to make the first move. At this point now, he has to react to what Sherman's doing. And it's like you say, make him pay for it every step. I just don't see, after he loses that first, being able to get off first, I just don't see him at any other point being able to put himself in a position to actually crush or force out of Georgia Sherman's military division of Mississippi. There's nowhere that he can do it.
I'm not making the claim that he could. I'm not making the claim that he could force him out of Georgia. I'm making the claim that he needs to make Sherman pay for every inch of ground that he's getting in the blood and toil of his men. So that
how long can he maintain that kind of attrition rate based on just on numbers? Like
we don't know. Because we don't know what Sherman's made of. I have a tendency to believe that Sherman, we like to think of him as this tough, raw-hewn Midwestern general in the form of Grant. I wonder out loud if Sherman would have, on some level, if Johnston had gone with him with both barrels, maybe he would have retreated back to Chattanooga. Who knows? We know what happened with the strategy that they took. Atlanta was taken, and the Confederate Army pretty much went into Tennessee and got themselves destroyed, and Lincoln won a re-election. So
that pretty much sealed the deal right there.
Absolutely. But no, this was fun, gentlemen. I appreciate it.
No, I have a couple more questions. You have to excuse me real quick. I need to refill and check my phone, which is charging in the other room. I'll be back in a minute.
I've got about 10, 15
Yeah,
minutes.
I think 10 minutes is probably good here. I also did upgrade to Zoom Pro so that our meetings are not limited to 40 minutes time wise. So
Good, thank you.
Otherwise we would have been cut off. And
I don't know, Benny, you're an Overland campaign guy. Do you think Johnston handled the Atlanta campaign properly?
I mean, it's hard to go one or two decisions beyond what actually happened historically. But I think it's a dire contrast to what Lee's strategy was. Lee sought to fight Grant Grant was hell bent on getting through the wilderness before Lee knew what his plans were, and Lee was hell-bent on hitting Grant as disorganized as possible. They were both seeking each other out. They were seeking a fight. They weren't seeking position. And it seems like the Sherman Johnston strategy was to seek this positioning game rather than seeking a fight. It's like if you're playing football, to put it
I
into
like football.
yeah. So it's the Eastern Theater strategy is to take your biggest fullback and just plow through the line, grind and pound. And if you gain a few yards, great, because you get 2 more downs. If you don't, you get another couple chances. Sherman and Johnston's strategy is all these trick plays to try to get the other side off balance
Outside
without really
reverses and
incurring
stuff.
any sort of physicality. And Lee and Grant are just, smash mouth football. It's like Big 10 football versus Big 12 football.
And what I'm saying is in
Hey.
1861 and 60, what I'm saying is in 1861 and 62, that strategy works. In 64,
Right.
when you're facing a Republican president that's running for re-election, and you know that you could win the war if you elect a Democrat, you want to do what Lee's doing to Grant. You want to make them pay for every inch that they're gaining in blood. More questions there, Dylan?
Yeah, so I was wondering, I have a few notes here. I actually made a lot of notes talking about the campaign going into Kennesaw, but we'll save that for another time. I was wondering what troops were even left to defend the rest of Eastern Georgia after Sherman takes Atlanta, because what happens to Johnston's army after, or Hood's army after Atlanta? Obviously they lose Atlanta, and you said they go to North Alabama and Tennessee and get themselves destroyed. Yep. What's left in between them and Savannah?
Home Guard, cavalry, partisan Rangers. Not a lot. There's
no actual like Confederate army force.
There's some Confederate infantry at Savannah, I think, under Hardee. Hardee's going to end up going down to Savannah and taking charge of that garrison down there. But as far as really good, solid infantry to contest Sherman, absolutely not.
Wow. So I don't know if we should save that for another one. Maybe talk about the Battle of Atlanta.
Oh, that's a program in and of itself. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking. I was about to get into that, but that's a whole other thing. Kennesaw line just is wild to me. We were talking about how well preserved, those earthworks are that they have there still. And then there's actually a couple of markers to where the truces happened. You mentioned there was a couple of truces that happened on the battle. And I think that those are so interesting because you see truces happen every once in a while throughout the war, but I don't think there's another example where 2 happen in the same battle like that. I mean, that's pretty wild. And then just a couple of cool anecdotes I know about those just off the top of my head. The one, I forget his name, Colonel William, who called the first truce for the fire. Anyways,
it was an Arkansas colonel, I know, but I forget his name.
I know they're to the right of the salient a little bit, but anyways, so when they call that truce,
William Martin.
Afterwards, what is it?
William Martin.
William Martin. So when the next day, Colonel William Martin is actually awarded a set of dueling pistols from the federal officer who was on the other side that he was facing at that time for his gallantry and for such a noble, honorable act to call a truce to allow his men to take them off the field. And then the other one on the salient, something I thought was interesting was they called that truce to let them bury their dead that were stinking up the place, but they weren't allowed to take anything off of the dead. So you have officers that are being buried with, gold watch fobs and all kinds of decorative stuff, and everything in these men's pockets. If they had, letters home or anything, was all buried with them. They weren't allowed to pull anything off their bodies. And I don't know necessarily why, if they don't want them like resupplying with ammo or anything, if that has to be the reason. But I thought that was kind of a sad part of that truce, like where it's a good thing they called the truce to let them do that. And obviously they really wanted to do it just to get rid of the smell. That's kind of a sad part of it, I think, to think of like all the guys that maybe had things they wanted to get off of their person that they weren't allowed to.
Right. Right.
But just such a cool battlefield to go visit,
Oh
and
yeah.
so glossed over by Ben's favorite campaign of the whole war. And it's
Hey,
really it
nothing's
has so many
nothing's
similarities, but it's such a different campaign at the same time.
You got two
nothing's
generals that don't like to fight.
right.
Yeah.
That's what
Nothing's
it is.
glossed over as much as Gettysburg glosses over everything. So at least I'm not that basic.
I thought we were gonna get through our first episode without saying the G word.
Sorry.
No way, that's not possible.
Without- No, we've said, or no, I guess you said Pennsylvania campaign.
Yeah, I did.
Oh no, I ruined it. Also, I hear the wildlife, especially the snakes, are really interesting to see at Kennesaw Mountain.
That is true. That is true. It's a great
Thank
place
God.
to go. Everybody should check it out.
Imagine like having to stay low because of sharpshooters like on the picket line, and then you're just hunkered down, and all of a sudden a fat 7-foot cottonmouth just starts crawling up your pant leg. Like, no, I'm taking the Yankee bullet, dude. I'm sorry, I don't care. I'm not dealing with that snake.
When we were down there last spring, Cwayna got a little irritated because he was trying to lead us out to the dead angle, and everyone got sidetracked by the snake that was crawling across. So, like, just sitting there watching the snake.
I'm trying to give
Ben's like,
score.
come on, like, who gives a shit about this snake? and
oh, everybody,
leading,
stop! Look at the snake.
and everyone's
They
just
were enthralled by
mesmerized
this
by.
snake.
I have a video of the snake somewhere. I don't
Do
know
you
if I have
remember
any.
when we were drilling at PCWA and we marched in column right through that field, and there was like 5 different snakes in that field that our whole column somehow found every one of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
All I can say is I'm so glad I wasn't in the front of that formation. I would have blown the whole formation. I would have just taken off. Like, I had to see men in front of me going around it. Otherwise I would have freaked.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. That was funny.
Well, this was good, gentlemen. I think it's a good discussion, and I appreciate everybody's attention, and we hope people enjoy it. If anybody ends up watching it, maybe they will, maybe they won't, but
Hey, I had fun doing it, whether people watch this or not. I really like just having these conversations with you guys and really actually getting into it and learning about this kind of stuff. I mean, it's the only way to really get like it's one thing to read, but I feel like when you actually discuss and think about other options and think outside the box a little bit and like bring it out to the public, like that's a different kind of learning. And I have a good time doing that.
Yeah. Next time I'll be in the war room, we'll have the whole library up, and if we need to research.
You could throw in an officer's kit since you clearly are the master here.
We'll see. But it'll be fun. So we'll have to talk about our next one, and appreciate everybody's indulgence.
Absolutely. Yeah. I just want to thank everyone for listening. If anyone's out there, please keep tuning in. We're going to keep doing this. We're going to go over all kinds of different topics. There's going to be episodes about, just reenactment stuff. There's going to be different presentations. We're going to be bringing on other people, guests to talk to. It's going to only grow bigger and better from here. So please give us the benefit of the doubt. This was our first attempt.
And if anyone has stuff they want to hear about or anything like that,
yeah, please send us topics.
We only have like 3 episodes planned so far, so feel free to send ideas. We'll pander.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen.
Well, gentlemen, enjoy your Friday nights. Cheers. And here's to the men who fought and died on Kennesaw Mountain. Evening, boys.
See you.